Coming up in this week's Torah Pearls.
The house of Jehovah is mentioned in this Torah portion. It occurs 255 times in the Hebrew Bible. But wait a minute, the house of Jehovah?
Babylonian lore doesn't make its way into this Torah portion.
Did the elders of Israel actually see God? Did they behold God and eat and drink?
How to kill a slave and get away with it.
What kind of insect was used to drive out the 7 Canaanite nations?
Who instructed Moses to throw blood on the people?
All right, Jono, let's jump into this thing.
All right. G'day, dear viewers, and thank you for your company once again here on truth2u.org. That's truth, the number 2, letter U.org. I'm Jono Vandor, and joining me from the HOREB Institute in Louisiana is the author of the Moses Scroll, Ross Nichols. G'day, mate.
Hello, Jono. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing pretty well, and I have to admit, of course, we're doing Torah Pearls, Season 3, and we are in Mishpatim, and after the Ten Commandments, after Yitro that we did last week, when I first started looking at this one, I thought, I almost want to yawn. It's not as exciting. It's like
that's a hard act to follow. It's a hard act.
It's a hard act to follow. But you know what? As I continued to look a little deeper, and particularly when I got to chapter 24, I thought, you know what? There's a lot of really interesting stuff in this one. So we do have a lot to get to today.
We do.
And we should kick off with our good friend Ezra, our AI critical scholar, with a summary of Mishpatim. Go ahead, Ezra.
Mishpatim is where the Torah shifts from the dramatic events at Sinai to the nitty-gritty of daily life. After the Ten Commandments, we get a deep dive into civil and ethical laws, covering everything from servitude, personal injury, property rights, and justice, to how Israel should treat the vulnerable in society. There's also a strong emphasis on fairness in legal matters, prohibition of bribery, and care for the stranger, widow, and orphan. Toward the end, we circle back to covenantal themes, with Israel affirming its commitment to God's laws, followed by a powerful vision of Moses, Aaron, and the elders encountering God on the mountain. It's a portion packed with legal and moral foundations that shape biblical justice.
Yeah, well, that's true. So the first few chapters do deal with the nitty-gritty of everyday life, civil law. And there is a question, Ross, which we will address, and that is, who is speaking here? And really, is this actually divinely imparted to Moses? So we're going to look a little closer at some of these laws. And then, like I said, when we get to chapter 24, all of a sudden there's a bunch of people having a party with God on Mount Sinai, which is kind of unexpected. And we will look at that as well. What are your initial thoughts, Ross?
I tell you, I'm with you. I was also under the impression following Torah Portion Yitro that this would be a bit of a yawn, but having looked into it, I started finding more things. But one thing that really captures me at first, we'll have to quickly hit some high points, is when you look at chapter 20, verse 22, that last little piece of Torah Portion Yitro at the white space, and you work yourself all the way through the end of chapter 23, or 23, verse 33, that section is referred to a couple of different ways by scholars, either the covenant code or the covenant collection. And it is a mixed bag, as we say. I mean, there are laws of all sorts. What I get a kick out of, and I mean this, is seeing how people try to put that in certain buckets. Did you notice any of that when you look like these are laws that, trying to make some order out of it? Now, there's some of that, but really, it is just all over the place. Do you find that to be the same? Or
I was complaining to Alistair yesterday in the library when I was reading through this. I said, this is an absolute schmozzle. I've never seen this before. But when you look at Mishpatim from the critical perspective, and particularly with the Moses Scroll in mind, it is all over the shop. It absolutely is. And it is interesting how not just the Moses Scroll, we have different law codes in here as well.
That's
but
right.
We do get little sound bites of the Moses Scroll in here, and we'll be highlighting those as we go through. Needless to say, Ross, that the vast majority of this, and I mean the vast majority, is not found obviously in the Moses Scroll. And it does kick off with with this phrase, these are the rules. These are the rules, Ross.
These are the rules.
Which you shall set before them. And that immediately reminded me of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 1. And this is the instruction. Now, before we get there, actually, the end of chapter 5, and this is where Deuteronomy departs from the Moses Scroll. But chapter 5 of Deuteronomy is, heavily derived from the Moses Scroll.
Right.
But after the quoting of the Moses Scroll, it says, Jehovah says to Moses, now listen, tell everyone to go back to their tent, and then you draw near, and then I'll give you all the instructions and all the rules. I'm going to give you, the rest of the stuff that you need to know. And so we're reading, going, well, this will be really interesting. And then we get to 6 verse 1 and it says, and this is the instruction, the laws and the rules that the Lord your God has commanded. And then it doesn't really give you any at all.
Right.
And really for the next few chapters, we get, again, little bits of Moses Scroll. We get a lot of emphatic and repetition, repeated material. But it's not until we get to the law code of chapter 12, verse 1, that it then kicks off again. It's like, oh, where was I? Oh, that's right. These are the laws and the rules that you must carefully observe in the land that the Lord your God, your father, is giving you. Right. But the thing is, Ross, the law code between 12 and 26 of Deuteronomy has very little in common, I think, with the law code that we're about to read. Does that sound about right to you?
Very, very fair. In fact, Deuteronomy's law code is so different that it's why when scholars look at this material, they call it something totally different. Now, we do have a little bit of overlap. One quick point I wanted to make, Jono, that you reminded me of when you were just giving that little piece that you just gave, and that is that both Exodus and Deuteronomy follow the giving of the 10 words with this sort of a private revelation to Moses that he is then to, convey. But the other thing that I thought about, and they don't agree, but the other piece that I thought about was in the Moses scroll, where does the Shema come? Before?
The Shema is before.
That's right. And so it's interesting that in the canonical Deuteronomy, Shema comes after. It's almost like the material has been shuffled around a little bit. So the elephant in the room is, why would God, if he had something that was very important to the people, he had all of their attention, not just give them, you and I could read this in just a few minutes, these different laws. It just seems a little bit odd to me. I don't know.
And it gets even more odd when you really pay a lot of attention to the individual laws. We're going to be doing some of that. Now, viewers may recall that in Beshalach, a couple of weeks ago, when we did Beshalach, I mentioned that there were striking similarities in structure and phraseology with the Ramses Kadesh poem, the victory poem, right, with Exodus chapter 15. And that should be not surprising to people because we also see examples of this where there's been borrowing, say in Psalm 29 or Psalm 104. You can go there and have a look at that. And that's song or poems. Here we have a little bit of borrowing from law codes, Ross, and which finds itself in our Torah portion. And that law code is the Hammurabi law code, the Babylonian law code, which predates Moses by about 4 or 5 centuries.
And how much similarity do we find? I know a lot of people say that, this is based on something like the Hammurabi
Lex
code.
talionis, for example, the eye for an eye. There's one example there. The law in regards to a man being gorged by an ox and what to do about that. Also laws regarding how to treat slaves and things like that. There's a handful of striking similarities.
Speaking of Lex talionis, let's bring Ezra in on this little piece here about maybe comparing some of the rules in the covenant code with Lex talionis and say Hammurabi's code. Let's ask Ezra. Ezra, what do you think?
Scholars have long noted striking parallels between the covenant code in Exodus 21 to 23 and the Code of Hammurabi, along with other ancient Near Eastern legal traditions. Both legal collections deal with similar topics: slavery, personal injury, property laws, and justice, but with key differences in emphasis and approach. For example, Both codes include the principle of lex talionis, or an eye for an eye, as a way to limit excessive retribution. However, in the Torah, this concept is often interpreted within a framework that allows for compensation rather than literal physical punishment. Another major distinction is how the covenant code integrates social ethics, particularly in its concern for the vulnerable, the widow, orphan, and stranger, something not as prominent in Hammurabi's code, which is more rigidly stratified by class. Rather than direct borrowing, many scholars see these similarities as evidence that Israelite law emerged within the broader legal traditions of the ancient Near East, while adapting them to a theological and ethical framework centered on covenant with Yahweh.
Yeah, so that's interesting. That's fair as well, because it does become a question of, is it borrowed or is it appropriated? And it's fine. I mean, really, it's fine to have civil laws, and if they're good laws, by all means, incorporate them into your law structure. The problem becomes, Ross, when it is passed off as being divinely imparted. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's one problem, and the other problem is to take all of the biblical law code and say that none of that is original, that all of that is borrowed or stolen or appropriated from these other law codes, where we now know that there are some distinct differences. In other words, it's almost like surely there are some borrowings between one people group in the ancient Near East and another, because a lot of these laws just make common sense. But one thing that I've read, and I want to do more research on this, is that the Hebrew law code, whether we date this back to the time of Moses or much later or whatever we do with it, one of the things that I read is an interesting difference is that the emphasis on the servant, the slave, is placed more up front in the covenant code than what you find in the other, and the treatment for the slaves is a little bit better, right? So not saying that it's totally, we're going to talk about some examples where you still hadn't quite fixed all the issues with the treatment of servants in this text, but
sure, but there is an emphasis there that's undeniable, and there's something going on with that I have not figured out, and it's probably too deep for me, but perhaps it is connected with the change between Exodus and Deuteronomy when it comes to the Shabbat commandment, the reason for Shabbat. In Deuteronomy, obviously, we have an emphasis on the slave, and it is a curious thing. Why is that? What is going on? I don't know, but we may revisit that when we get to Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
So listen, I have a question.
Yep. All right.
Who is speaking? Who is speaking, Ross? Because when it kicks off, the way that it begins, these are the rules that I shall give you. It seems like the you is Moses.
Yeah.
But is it? Because as we read through this, God is referred to in the third person in chapter 22, verses 7 and 8, in verse 19. But then it switches back in verse 22 to 26 in the first person, and then back again in verse 27, and then back to the first person in verse 28. Who's speaking here, Ross?
I tell you, I am of the same confused state in some ways. If you begin, like you said, and these are the Mishpatim, which this is singular, masculine, so we don't know who the speaker is. We assume that it's God, but that's because if we go back to the end of the last Torah portion, if we go back to chapter 20 and verse 22, it says, "And Jehovah spoke unto Moses," and then it goes on and it gives certain things about do this and sacrifices and altars and so forth. And it really just continues in verse 1. Even though there is a major break in the text, we assume then that it's Jehovah speaking to Moses, at least initially. But then, as you point out, later in the text, there is an even greater switching going on, and there are references to Jehovah. So does the speaker change? We'll see some of those shortly.
All right, so let's focus on some of these laws. Where do you want to start?
Well, I tell you, I just mentioned that there is a focus at first on Hebrew servants, and trying to treat them in a certain way. And so if we look, let's say, Jono, if you have a servant and this servant says, I love my master, my wife, my children, this is verse 5, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him unto God. I need you to answer that for me. What does that mean? And shall bring him to the door or unto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. That just doesn't sound like the kind of ear piercing you get at the local mall. That's a little bit.
It doesn't. I don't know, but it needs a little bit more context, though, see, Ross, because when you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go free without payment. If he came single, Ross, he shall leave single. If he had a wife, his wife shall leave with him. That's nice. If his master gave him a wife, and she has borne him children, the wife and her children shall belong to the master. So I kind of feel like that might influence his decision to love the master, you know? It's a little bit...
that might let him put his ear, that might help him to encourage him to put his earlobe to the door frame, is what you're saying.
So it's kind of like, so my time is up and I'm a free man, but you get to keep my wife and my children. You know what?
I think I'll stick around.
I love the master. Yeah, put an earring in my ear, dude. Thanks. So that's what's going on there. Before God, I have no idea what that's supposed to mean. He shall be brought to the door or the doorposts and pierce his ear and so on and so forth.
Well, we see also, just so people can put this in their notes and have a little bit more context, maybe to help them determine what does it mean to bring this person before God. It's also in chapter 22, verse 9, which we'll see later. But so the idea is generally, a lot of times in the Pentateuch, when we see that, it indicates you present this person to at the sanctuary. So, you know, and so that's what it feels like it's trying to say.
And it may also be a public declaration, you know, at the front of the door of the house is not inside, it's outside. People can see what's going on. It's like a public declaration of what he's saying. 7, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, as one does, he shall not be freed, she shall not be freed as male slaves are, if she proves to be displeasing to her master, who designated her for himself. He must let her be redeemed. He shall not have the right to sell her to outsiders, since he broke faith with her. What does this mean? Is this all euphemisms, Ross? What are we looking at here?
I think so. Yeah, I think it's euphemisms. And it goes into all sorts of rules. Which, by the way, this is not the only text. Here's something that I want people to consider. You mentioned as soon as we kicked off that we have different law codes in the biblical text within the Pentateuch. So, for instance, we get some similar but not identical laws also in Deuteronomy 15. Deuteronomy 15, verse 12 and 17 deal with this female servant. So we do see some. So the question would be, if this is to be thought of as divinely inspired and a singular author, why is it that, you know, we have in different places different, I guess,
significant differences on the
versions.
Same topic. Yeah. Verse 12, he who fatally strikes a man shall be put to death, Ross. If he did not do it by design, now I'm interested in what you've got there in your Torah tablet. If he did not do it by design, but it came about by an act of God, so God did it, I will assign you a place to which you can flee. What do you got in 12? Is it an
he
act
that
of God?
smiteth a man so that he dieth, smiteth, shall surely be put to death. And if a man lie not in wait, in other words, it's not premeditated, but God deliver into his hand, then I shall appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. Sanctuary cities, Jono, they're all in the news now in the United States. Sanctuary cities.
That's true, isn't it?
Yep. And if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from mine altar. Mine altar, Jono, where this is talking about.
We don't read about this stuff until so we've got sanctuary cities and we've got fleeing to the altar, but where is that in the text?
Well, you know, it's interesting that part of this law code, remember at the end of Yitro, it mentions this altar and you don't climb up the steps and show, you know,
you need
remember all that. But the idea, though, is that we don't have an altar yet. So I guess a fundamentalist would say, well, he's getting them ready because they're going to have an altar very soon.
Going to have, and then eventually you're going to have the horns of the altar to which you can flee to and hold on to the horns of the altar until you get hungry, I guess. I don't know what happens then, but or you need to use the restroom, but you're supposed to be free. But not in this case. If you do that to the altar that we don't have yet, you can be dragged away from that if you've killed someone deliberately.
Here's something. There's a real concern. I mean, first of all, this is very interesting that there is a distinction to be made between homicide, which is intentional, and manslaughter, what we call manslaughter, unintentional homicide. And this is very nice to read in an ancient text, that there is a distinction to be made in there.
Well,
now we get into these familial laws, these family type laws. He that smites his father or his mother shall be put to death, and so forth. And if you kidnap somebody, you'll be put to death. Verse 17, I wanted to draw attention to. He that curseth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. In the Moses scroll, there is in GE 10 a corresponding passage, really, not quite.
If I remember correctly, I think you translated this as esteemed lightly. Is that the way you?
That's right. Esteems lightly because it's translated curse, but both in the Moses scroll and in the Masoretic text, the passage is the same. It's kof lamed lamed. So it is the same word to consider, to esteem lightly. It's not doesn't quite mean curse. A closer word for curse would be aleph resh resh. But in this sense, it's whoever esteems his parents lightly. Notice in the Moses scroll, it says, cursed is the man who esteems his father and his mother lightly. This is the corresponding curse to the command to give weight, which is the opposite of esteem lightly.
Esteem lightly, to give weight to your mother and your mother.
Yep. So interestingly enough, but in the Moses scroll, as we've often pointed out, cursing, you don't need to say cursed and then he'll be put to death. Because, it's like, why would you curse somebody and then kill them?
And then kill them. What is the point of a curse if you're just going to knock them off? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the Moses scroll has no death penalty. That's right.
Yep.
Yeah. And I mean, again, it's fine for a society, I think, to determine these things for themselves and say, well, we want to use these 10 divine dictates as our ethical code. And therefore we want to structure law around it so that people will keep it. And therefore we will have these punishments. I mean, all of this thing, I think that's fine. But again, to pass it off as divinely imparted is a different story. So that's the first connection with the Moses scroll. 18, when men quarrel and one strikes another.
As they do from time to time.
With a stone or a fist, and he doesn't die, but has to take to his bed. Well, Ross, if he gets up and walks around, just get over it. Come on. He's all right. Look at him. He's all right. He's walking around. He'll be fine. He'll be fine. Don't worry about it. When a man strikes his slave, though, male or female, with a rod, and he dies then and there, well, then he must be avenged, Ross, if he dies then and there. But if he survives a day or two, he's not to be avenged since he is the other's property. So the lesson from this, Ross, is if you have a slave, male or female, who doesn't quite cut it, maybe they don't make your coffee right in the morning or something, and you just want to knock them off, don't do it immediately. You need to do it slowly and painfully so that they'll last at least a day or two. And then you get away with it.
I actually thought about, as a parent of several children, I've seen where a bigger and older one will pick on another one and then bring them to a bad place, either hurt them or make them cry. And then you see them over or around saying, no, you're okay, and nurse them back. So that's what this is. If you injure a servant, they want you to nurse them back.
In a way that might be fatal. Just look after them for a day or two, then you're in the clear.
What if these men are fighting together and they hurt a woman with a child?
Well, I tell you what, this is, and I was talking to, again, Alistair at the library about this. For a while, it sort of baffled me, Ross, that, because I'm a very pro-life individual, I think you probably are too.
Yeah.
I'm pro-life all the way. I think that, I'm just going to say it, I think abortion is one of the most horrific crimes of our time, and I think that history will look back on it with absolute horror, and it should.
I agree.
So when I see debates regarding this issue, I'm always really quite stunned that they don't refer back to the passage I'm about to read in Exodus, because it would have been the first place that I would go, at least from a biblical perspective. And what I found was that this verse reads very differently in, say, the JPS to your Torah tablet. So maybe I might read mine and then you can read yours. Is that okay? So this is 21 verse 22 and 23, at least in the Hebrew. Is it the same in the...
I think so.
Okay. It says, 22, 23, when men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may extract from him the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, so on and so forth. What that seems to be saying, once again, a pregnant woman is inadvertently harmed when men are fighting, and as a result she miscarriages, but she's okay. Sure, she's had a miscarriage, but she's all right. And as long as no other harm comes to her, you can fine him. However, if there is harm to her, well, then whatever that harm is shall be inflicted upon the man who's responsible for that. That's the way it reads here. What do you got in your Torah tablet?
All right, I'm going to read this, and you tell me if it changes your view of what you just said. And if men strive together and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart, and yet no harm follow, he shall surely be fined, according as the woman's husband shall lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judge determine. But if any harm follow, then thou shalt give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. What does that mean?
The implication you get from the ASV is that if she gives birth prematurely but the child survives, so that, what does it say? It says, so her fruit departs from her, but it's okay, like there's no harm that follows. However, if she gives birth and there is harm or the child dies, then it's life for life. So from a pro-life perspective, you would look at that and say, well, you see, it's life for life. If the child dies, it is life for life. Therefore, as a pro-life perspective. Now, let me read what Freeman has here. So this is 21 verse 22, because it's interesting. And this is probably more literal, I think. And if people will fight and they strike a pregnant woman and her children go out, and there will be not an injury, he shall be penalized according to what the woman's husband will impose upon him, and he will give it by the judges. And if there be an injury, then you shall give a life for a life. That is more literal. And the thing about it is, because that is actually the way that it reads in the Hebrew, it's ambiguous. It really actually is ambiguous, and it can be argued either side. And that's the reason why in debates they don't use it. They don't go there.
I understand. And I have seen quite a bit recently because this is such a topic, not just in the U.S., but many other. It's always brought into a political place. And one side demonizes the other. It's always like that. But in this case, this argument could be looked at for either side, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, just one other point, and not to get off this too quickly if you had more on that, but I was going to say, Again, we see lex talionis. Again, we see it quite a bit in here. And I also have in my notes Leviticus 24, 19 and 20, and Deuteronomy 19, verse 21. We don't have to look at those, but I'm just saying that we do see this principle repeated quite a few different ways in different places in the Pentateuch.
Well, I'll just say this, just returning to what we were talking about, verse 22, the Jewish Study Bible has a study note there, and it says, other damages to the woman based on reckoning, perhaps reckoning the age of the fetus, but both this translation and the alternative, as judges determine, are questionable. Halakhic exegesis, Ross. Halakhic exegesis infers that since the punishment is monetary rather than execution, the unborn fetus is not considered a living person, and feticide is not murder. Hence, abortion is permitted when necessary to save the mother. Okay, so fine. So that's that. I guess that's the liberal way of, we might say, it's the liberal way of interpreting it. But the interesting thing about it is, if this is a divinely imparted law, for example, why is it ambiguous? Why can it be argued on either side of the fence? It's just something to consider. What else are we going to look at here?
Well, I do know this. If a man, verse 26, smite the eye of his servant or the eye of his maid and destroy it, he has to let him go free for his eye's sake. This is what you call out of sight, out of mind. You got to let him go.
Got to let him go because okay, so you've destroyed one of his eyes, or you knocked out one of his teeth. You let him go. That's it. You've forfeited. But here's the thing, Ross. If you beat him within an inch of his life, he's still yours. What? Explain that one to me. Because like if we go back, it does say you beat him within an inch of his life and he dies a couple of days later. It's a couple of days later, and he is your property after all. But if you destroy one of his eyes in that beating, well, you've got to let him go. Explain that one.
I don't know, but I know this. In the military, there's a thing that was called a blanket party, and if you beat somebody, the idea was there were certain areas you couldn't, you didn't hit above. It had to be, this area here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hey, what? Then there's quite a bit on the ox, verses 28 and following. Various rules there. If you stone an ox and so forth, or if the ox is if this ox is known to attack and gore people, there's certain rules. And did you have anything you wanted to talk about?
Stone the ox. You can't just slaughter it, and you certainly can't eat it if you are going to slaughter it. Don't eat it, and don't slaughter it. Just stone it to death. That ox. And by the way, if that ox has done that before, 1 or 2 or 3 times, I'm not sure how many times it has to be established. But the owner, Jimmy, you can stone him as well. Stone him as well. Why not?
Ox for ox. There's a lot, but
unless,
you really
unless it gorges a slave, Ross, then hey.
What verse is that?
Well, what verse is that? Oh, 32, verse 32. But if the ox gorges a slave, male or female, he shall pay just 30 shekels of silver to the master. And the ox, you can still stone the ox, but don't kill the master, because it was just a slave, Ross.
These are really strange texts, aren't they? And I know that some might say, well, you just don't get it. These are divinely imparted laws, but interesting. I on the ox.
Yeah.
Hey, what about the thief? What about the thief? Now, by the way, the English and Hebrew verses are going to be different here. Did I jump too far? Or I'm
just saying I want to bring this one back. So this is in the Jewish Study Bible. This is chapter 22, verse 1. What is it in yours?
In the Hebrew, in the English, and I have both indicated in the Torah tablet, but it's either 22 verse 1, if a man shall steal an ox, or Hebrew verse 37. So Hebrew 22, Hebrew 22 1 in the Hebrew. If the thief be found breaking in, all right, then be smitten that he dies, there shall be no blood guiltiness for him.
Mm-hmm. That one, I like that one. I'd like to bring that one back.
I think you don't have to bring it back in Louisiana. I think that's a rule here.
Is that right?
I think so. Now, look, I might be wrong about this, so nobody you check with your local authorities.
Don't go breaking into Ross's house because he will beat you to death.
If you come into my house, then I'm not going to tell you anything, but watch out for Bridget. You probably would be begging to get out of there. But anyway, it says, if the sun comes up on him, then there will be blood guiltiness, and he has to make restitution. If he has nothing, he'll be sold for his theft, and if he's found with the theft, he's got to pay double, and there's all these other rules. But again, if somebody breaks into your house and you beat them, hey, I think that's the Louisiana law.
That's a fair deal. Verse 8, in all charges of misappropriation pertaining to an ox, an ass, a sheep, a garment, or any other loss, wherefore one party alleges, this is it, the case, and this is to your point earlier, the case of both parties shall come before God.
Yeah.
He whom God declares guilty shall pay double to the other. Now that, I read that and I thought, if this really is not divinely imparted, and you bring them before God, how is this determined? And are they going to throw lots, or what are they going to do? And Jimmy, who's innocent, all of a sudden is declared by God to be guilty. I don't know about that.
Well, it seems, again, in most of these texts in the Pentateuch, when we're dealing with legal codes, most often, particularly once we have the ark and the testimony and the tabernacle and the zones of sanctity, and whenever we read, generally at that point, we're reading that before God means at this holy sanctuary site. Right. But let me ask you this. If you go down a little bit to verse 11 or 10 in the Hebrew, the oath of Jehovah shall be between them both, whether he hath not put his hand unto his neighbor's goods, and the owner thereof shall accept it, and he shall not make restitution. So
swearing in the name of Jehovah.
Yeah, this is one of the earliest references to the oath taking, in that sacred precinct, I guess you would say, an oath of Jehovah.
Now, remind me, in the Moses Scroll, doesn't it mention swearing in the name of Elohim?
We'll have to look. I know in Deuteronomy there are a couple of different references to swearing in the name, but I do know that there is a command that you're not to swear falsely by the name. So that would at least indicate that.
That's
right. So I think that's what we're looking at there.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay.
What else you got in this chapter? Lots of different rules on property and restitution. How about killing a witch?
Yeah, where's that?
That's verse 18, verse 17 in the Hebrew. Thou shalt not suffer a sorceress to live. Kill the witches. By the way, I was curious that phrase, that it's kashef is the word for witch. It's in Exodus chapter 7, verse 11. It's the same word for sorcerers. It's there in the masculine plural in Exodus 7:11, because it's dealing with the sorcerers that were part of the Egyptian court. But we also have that in Deuteronomy 18, part of the Deuteronomy's law code. Then I was wondering, just because I didn't know off the top of my head, if the witch of Endor was the same word here, but it's not. It's in the witch of Endor is referred to as a Baalat Ov, a mistress of ghost, I guess you would call it.
Oh, that's cool.
Isn't that cool? A mistress of ghost.
It should say that. It should say the mistress of ghosts. So just to remind everybody, this is where Saul goes to inquire of a witch because God has stopped talking to him, and she claims to conjure up the spirit of the ghost of Samuel, who's wearing his ghost clothes. I love ghost clothes. All right, that's number one.
He was asleep.
He was asleep. Says, why do you bring me up? Yeah, why do you bring me up? And I had to put my ghost clothes on, and here I am. And that's how he was recognized, by his ghost clothes. The question about that, and we won't go into it now, but who recorded that? Because the next day, Saul and his sons were dead.
The witch did.
You reckon the witch wrote this part of the Bible? Okay.
Who else?
Okay, done. I didn't think of that.
Hey,
So,
I found another connection with the Moses scroll.
Moses
The
scroll,
very
go
next
ahead.
section.
Mm,
Whosoever lies with a beast shall
mm.
surely be put to death. Well,
Put that goat
actually,
down.
GE 13. Let me look
Mm.
at this. Let me look at this.
Because it's part of the curses,
Yeah, GE
or
13. Let's see. I'm just going
yeah.
to flip over
Cursed is the
to
man
it. You got
who
it?
draws near to any close relative, or who commits adultery with his neighbor's woman, or who lies with any animal.
Now, it
Cursed be
doesn't
the
say, interestingly enough, we keep seeing this, and why would it be like this? I think we kind of have an idea, but it doesn't say if someone does this, they should be put to death. I mean, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be put to death for doing this, but the point is that the Moses scroll does not say anything about the death penalty for this. It just says, cursed is.
Mm-hmm.
All
Yeah,
right.
indeed. What
Yep.
else do we have here?
Hey,
Go
yep.
ahead.
Well, I just didn't want to skip over.
Oh, we did skip over one. We skipped
What?
over verse 12. Is it 12? No, now I'm in 23. I've jumped into 23. All right, no, you keep going.
Okay, I was just going to say verse 20 or verse 19 in the Hebrew, he that sacrifices unto any god, save unto Jehovah only, shall be utterly destroyed. Sacrifices, again, there's a whole lot of mention of sacrifices in this wilderness legal code.
It's easy to forget where they are when you're reading through this. It's easy to forget the context.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a lot, by the way, I did want to mention that there is a lot in the Pentateuch about kind treatment of sojourners and strangers. And, I think Richard Elliott Friedman points out that this idea, worded differently in various laws, occurs over 30 some odd times in the Pentateuch alone. And the idea is just be kind, treat strangers with kindness and so forth. And that seems to take precedent. And several times it says, why? Because you know what it's like. You know what it's like to be in that position.
And
also,
again, that echoes Deuteronomy chapter 5, the reason for Shabbat, as opposed to what it says in Exodus chapter 20. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to also add that the don't wrong the stranger is part of the covenant code, Exodus 22 and 23, and also in the holiness code of Leviticus 19 and verse 25 also, or chapter 25. Remember, we're going to see when we get to Leviticus 19, we're going to see some overlap there with the Moses scroll as well. So we'll get to that later.
You know what? I missed this. This is in the Hebrew Bible. It is chapter 22, verse 30. But you shall be a holy people to me. You must not eat flesh torn by beasts in the field. You shall cast it to the dogs. But we find out, I think, in Deuteronomy, don't we, that you can give it to Gentile Jimmy. You can do that. Give it to the dog or Jimmy.
Yeah, well, Deuteronomy 14, I had in my notes, be holy and food are tied together too, in the very beginning of that verse, be holy. And
is it 14:21 or is it, where does it say you can?
It is in chapter 14 because that's the dietary rule, but I don't have the verse. Right. But we skipped a couple. Let's just quickly, let me see, chapter 22, verse 24, I have 22 through 24, punishment for abusing widows and orphans if they cry to me. By the way, that's kind of a rule. If you do something to somebody and they cry to God, where is it that it says, I think it says that God's going to kill that person, right?
It says something to that effect with a sword. It says, if you do mistreat them, I will heed their outcry as soon as they cry out to me, and my anger shall blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword, and your own wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. The interesting thing about this as well, Ross, is that right here it switches into the first person, and God speaks in the first person here. It continues with that too. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, do not act towards them as creditors, exact no interest. If you do take from your neighbor's garment, you must return it before the sun sets. It's his only clothing. It's the sole covering of his skin. And what else will he sleep? It's interesting that there's a question thrown into that.
Yeah.
And therefore, if he cries out to me, I will pay heed, for I am compassionate. But then in verse 27, back to the third person, you shall not revile God, nor put a curse.
Nor curse a ruler of your people. What if?
That's right. What if you have Trump derangement syndrome, though?
I don't know if that counts. I don't know if that counts. But if it does,
blue hair, screaming.
Oh no. Hey, by the way, isn't there a story, I can't remember it now, but in the New Testament, isn't there a story where maybe Paul gets smacked and because he taught, remember he talked bad about the priest or something, and the guy punches him, and Paul says, "Hey, I didn't know you were a priest." It's this rule that he gets smacked around for because he spoke bad of the. But anyway, I don't remember that. Look it up, people.
Look it up.
That's a good one. All right, we got to keep rolling. There's a lot to be done here.
I was going to jump to 23:12, but have you got anything before that?
Nope. Go ahead. I'm ready.
I was just going to say this is another. I mentioned this last week as well, but 6 days. Yeah.
No, you did skip something. It's a connection with the Torah, the Moses scroll.
Yeah, give it to me.
Chapter 23. I have in my notes verses 6 through 8. Thou shalt not wrest the justice due to thy poor in his cause. Keep thee far from a false matter, and the innocent and the righteous slay thou not, for I will not justify the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds them that have sight and perverts the word of the righteous. And I have compare chapter 16, verse 19 in the book of Deuteronomy, and the HA2 in the Moses scroll, which talks about the bribe. Do you have that?
Yeah, well, HA2, I have it in front of me. It says, "Cursed is the man who swears by my name to deceive." And all the people will respond and say, "Hey, amen." Cursed is the one who takes a bribe to testify deceitfully against his associate. And they will respond and say, "Amen."
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Well,
there you go.
Quite right.
All right. Now I'm sorry. Ready. I'm ready to jump.
I was just going to reiterate that 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall cease. So from your labor, cease as opposed to rest. So in the Decalogue of Exodus chapter 20, we have rest there, whereas in the Moses scroll, God says, "And I ceased." And therefore, and then he says, "And you will cease." So we don't see here in this verse that on that day you shall rest. It says, "And you will cease," in concurrence with the Moses scroll.
Mm-hmm. Hey, how about this? Can I jump down to verse 19 of 23?
Yeah, go ahead.
Here we go. Well, let's look at verse 17. 3 times in a year all your males shall appear before the Lord Jehovah. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, neither shall the fat of my feast remain all night until the morning. The first of the firstfruits of thy ground thou shalt bring into the house of Jehovah thy God.
The what?
Don't boil a kid. Yeah, that's right. The house of Jehovah thy God. The house of Jehovah thy God, Jono. And look, that, by the way, that phrase, house of Jehovah, is 255 times in 231 verses. It's mentioned here in 23:19 and in 34:26. Let's look at that, Jono. Can we? 34:26. And just because I want to tell you something about this. Now, we're not going to get much into this. We've got to do this later because it's a very important passage. 34, I'm still getting there. There was something else. Okay, now in 34, let me just tell you that this is after the 10 tablets have been shattered in chapter 34. And in verse 1 of 34, it says, "And Jehovah said unto Moses, Hew, H-E-W, hew thee 2 tables of stone like unto the first, and I'll write upon the tables the words that were on the first." And then it gets, he says, "Come on up to the mountain sun," and so forth. Go to verse 26. "The first of thy first fruits of thy ground you shall bring unto the house of Jehovah thy God. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk." That is an exact That's exactly what we read here.
Yep.
The question is, what does that have to do with the 10 Commandments? I'm going to get a little bit into that when we get there. But the other thing is, what is the house of Jehovah? And if people are saying, well, it's the tabernacle at this point. No, it's not. We don't have a tabernacle yet.
Mm-hmm.
Not in chapter 23, do we?
Yeah, that's right. And so that's really interesting. I had not noticed that follows, that you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk follows on from that. But you're right. It's verbatim, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a repetition, which is interesting. And when we get to the chapter 34, we'll talk about why this appears in the exact form there. And by the way, it has something to do with chapter 34 is believed by scholars to be yet one more list of potential 10 commandments. But this one in 34 is called the ritual 10. The ritual 10. Then we get into the angel, right?
Yeah, then we have an angel. We've got to throw an angel into the mix. Who is the source now, Ross? Because
I think it's still E.
It's still E? Yeah, okay. For the most part, this is mostly E, and it doesn't really change, I think, until we get to chapter 24.
Right.
Before we get to chapter 24, though, we have in 23:23, we have a list. When my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, I will annihilate them. Well and good. But
wait, how many is that?
That's 6, Ross. That's 6. So we got to go to Deuteronomy chapter 7, and one is missing. One of them gets off scot-free.
The gigabytes.
The gigabytes or the Girgashites. The Girgashites. And but it's a little bit different, I think. It says, when the Lord your God brings you to the land you're about to enter and possess, he dislodges many nations before you. These ones that I just read, plus the Girgashites, 7 nations much larger than you, and the Lord your God delivers them to you, and you defeat them. So you must doom them to destruction and grant them no terms and give them no quarter, and you shall not intermarry with them. And don't give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your children away, and da-da-da-da-da. But here, God's like, well, maybe not the Girgashites, but I will annihilate all the other ones. Yeah, don't bow down to their gods.
How bad, let me ask you this. You have some crazy, I guess, insects and animals in Australia, don't you?
We do indeed.
Yeah. Do you have a hornet there that could chase nations? I bet you probably do. This is not.
No, I'm just thinking.
You probably have a butterfly there that could chase nations out, don't you?
We do have some wasps, but I think actually, I think if we had wars of our wasps against your wasps, I think your wasps are going to win. Now, I don't know what sort of wasps they might have in the Middle East. I don't know, but our wasps, they hurt, but I think you've got worse ones over there.
Speaking of these driving out these nations, look at verse 28. I will send the hornet before thee, which shall drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite from before thee. I'm not going to drive them out from before thee in a year, lest the land become desolate and the beasts of the field multiply against thee. By little and little I'll drive them out before you until thou be increased and inherit the land. A hornet, Jono. By the way, this word hornet, or word translated hornet, is also in Deuteronomy 7, verse 20, Joshua 24:12. And the idea is that an insect, and you could say insects, maybe it's like massive, but it's really singular. It's like one big bad hornet that's going to drive them out.
Yeah.
But here's something interesting. One of the first things that hit the newspapers when the Moses Scroll first appeared in England, because Ginsburg was doing the work of translating it, he said, I found something interesting in this book. And if you have the Moses Scroll, look at page 166. In 166, this is my translation. And notice this. Moreover, GA6 says, moreover, Elohim will send leprosy among them until those hiding and those remaining utterly perish from before you. Now, in the footnote 482, I put, The canonical version reads hornets, and that in the Hebrew is sirah, tsadi resh ayin hey, where Ginsburg proposed a reading of leprosy, tsadi resh ayin tav, in the Moses Scroll. However, it should be noted that neither Ginsburg nor Meyer was certain of the reading. Both recorded the first letter as hey and the final two letters as ayin tav. Based on the certainty of the final two letters, the word is not hornets. If the text did read leprosy, it should be noted that leprosy in the Bible, sara'at, is not what is known as Hansen's disease today. And I left it at that. But here's the thing. The word for leprosy is sort of a hangover from the Old English. And it really indicates a plague or a stroke of some kind, like a plague is probably a better way to put it.
Some sort of skin infliction, Ross? Is that what
It generally is associated with an affliction of the skin.
And maybe it looks like the kind of infliction that if you were to be stung by a hornet, you might end up with these
Maybe I hadn't thought about that, yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I'm just speculating, interesting.
I wrote an article, and I want people to read it, so it's in the description, in the notes in this description. It's called A More Dangerous Fiend, F-I-E-N-D.
Oh, yeah, I've read that. Yeah,
Sara'at, and not Sirah in Shapira's scroll.
Yeah, that's really good. I'll revisit that again too. I remember reading that. The other thing that I find interesting about this is that last week, viewers will recall that I mentioned a soundbite from the Moses Scroll that appears in that Torah portion, and that was chapter 18, verse 18, that says, all that Jehovah had done to Pharaoh and to Egypt. Whereas in GA4, it says, what Elohim did to Pharaoh and to all of Egypt. Well, here, in the section that you've just read, it follows directly on from that, because what you're looking at is a passage that contains some vocabulary and phraseology from GA5 and GA6, the next two lines of the Moses Scroll, which is really interesting. So again, I can quickly read that for you. So GA4, remember what Elohim did to Pharaoh and to all of Egypt, so Elohim will do to your enemies, because Elohim is crossing before you. He's consuming fire. He will destroy them. He will consume them quickly from before you. Moreover, Elohim will send leprosy, or whatever that skin affliction is, among them, until those hiding and those remaining will utterly perish from before you. And it seems pretty clear to me that this passage from 23, 27 to 32, I think, or those couple of verses are borrowing from the Moses Scroll. So there's little sound bites, as I say.
Yeah.
Now, while we're there, Ross, once again, a massive anachronism, the Sea of Philistia again. Verse 31.
Yeah.
How about that?
Yeah, yeah. Hey, 24, who is speaking in 24? Now, we're limited on time now, but this is where we've got to hit some high stuff, some good stuff quickly. You ready?
We got to do it because chapter 24 really blew my mind. And the reason why it did is because of Friedman's note. 24 begins with, and he said to Moses, come up to Jehovah, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu. The 70 elders of Israel bowed down from a distance, and so on and so forth. Well, Friedman says, note the curious fact that King Jeroboam's sons are Nahab and Abiyah in 1 Kings chapter 14, 1 and 20. Aaron's sons are Nadab and Abihu. The names of the sons of the two makers of the golden calf in the Bible are nearly the same. This is just part of a string of connections between the golden calf of Aaron and Jeroboam, and he's got more on that. But I tell you what, those connections, now you and I have speculated about what came first, the chicken or the egg. Was it Aaron who made the golden calf? Was it Jeroboam who made the golden calf? Because there's so many incredible similarities between these two stories. One is the original, and it may not be chronological. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and just to kind of highlight what you're just talking about, some people may not, that you have to read. I highly recommend reading Who Wrote the Bible, which is Richard Elliott Friedman's view on how the Bible came together, among other things. And one of the things that he points out, just to kind of piggyback off what you said there, if you look at the hypothesis is that you had an account of some of these stories from a northern priestly group and an account from a southern priestly group, the kingdom of Ephraim and Israel, or the kingdom of Judah, respectively. And one of the things that's interesting is that it seems that the northern group we associate E more with the north and J with the south. E is very pro-Moses and not pro-Aaron. In fact, it's whenever if E talks about Aaron, it's always in a negative light. And also if J talks about him, it's very positive. So we have this mix. But anyway, I think that it's interesting that we do get a sort of a crossover when you look at the stories from the north and you look at what happened. Jeroboam is the king of the north. And so you have the south is going to be very antagonistic to those stories. So it's one of the things that Friedman does is he tries to figure out what makes the most sense. Where do these stories come from? And that's where you get this kind of thing. Yeah.
I'm not going to read these. Got quite a note on this, and actually, so does Bretler has quite a note on chapter 24. But the way that it seems to me is that after piecing all of these various stories of the Mount Sinai narratives together, they were left with a bunch of offcuts. It appears to me, Ross. The bits that you cut out of the movie, and it's like, well, these are also sacred. What can we do with this? Can we make a narrative out of this jigsaw? And we end up with chapter 24. What are your thoughts?
Well, 24 has some really interesting things in it, and a lot of these are written sort of a third-person narrated situation. And one of the things I wanted to bring up, just to your very point there, is that if you look at verse 4, and Moses wrote all the words of Jehovah. And by the way, this is one of the 7 references of Moses writing something in the Pentateuch. All 7 are in the third person, indicating that it's an author other than Moses. And so I'll tell people, if you have the Moses scroll, you might want to refresh yourself, read again the section beginning on page 125. What did Moses write? So this is a third person narrative. There's some repetition here. There is some repetition.
But it's misplaced. Yeah, there's doublets, but it's put into different contexts, and that's why I say they've ended up with doubled material or material they didn't use, and they've just sort of gone, can we make something? Can we make a story out of this?
We're going to offer some burnt offerings, and
got to have the burnt offerings, and we end up with the 70 elders, and once again we have 70 and 12. We've got 12 pillars. Oh, now I got to talk about this, Ross. I have to take a second here. I know we're running out of time, but my goodness. Right. So once again, reading through Richard Elliott Freeman's translation here, I had to stop and do a double take on it, and I thought, my goodness, is that what it actually says? Here it is in chapter 24, verse 8. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people. And he said, here is the blood of the covenant that Jehovah has made with you regarding all these things. And I thought, hang on a second. Of course he threw it. Of course. What is the word? So I looked up the word, and the word is Zerach, and it's used 35 times in 33 verses. The first 2 times that it's used is when Moses scoops a hand of ashes and throws it to the sky. All right, a couple of times in chapter 9 of Exodus. And of course he throws it to the sky. He doesn't sprinkle ash around, but we end up with this euphemism of little sprinkle of blood. But when you actually read what it says, of course he scoops it up in a bowl and he throws it on the people. And that's, first of all, 2 things about this, Ross. Number 1, that's disgusting. Number 2, who told him to do that?
Well, let me add another one. First of all, you're describing this, and I think you're right about the Hebrew. It does indicate more than just kind of flicking little droplets. But remember now, we're talking about 2.7 million people if you follow the number. So it's like, I don't know if you have in Australia, we have in the States SeaWorld or something. It's that front row that gets the worst of it. Don't worry about it if you're not in the front row. But it is sort of strange. There is this bloody
It's more than
ritual
it's
that
super gross.
that is
I'll just be blunt about it.
It's not only that, but it's against what we read in other texts. Like in other texts, all of this stuff about the sacrifices seems to be in direct contradiction to passages like Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 21 and following. You got Amos chapter 5, verse 25. You have texts which seem to say there's a tension in the text. Some say that Moses is flinging blood on the people. It's the blood of the covenant. And then you have other texts which say there's no sacrifices at all in the wilderness. God never commanded that.
But so this is the thing, Ross. Like, so here's the people, right? And it is just beyond me. Like, Moses took the blood and he threw it on the people, and he said, and you can imagine the people like, "What are you doing? Why?" And he says, "Well, this is the blood of the covenant. This is the blood of the covenant that Jehovah has made with you regarding all these things."
You're saying that you don't think this is authentic to the time of Moses then?
Oh, what I'm saying is, where does Jehovah tell him to fling blood on everybody? It is just all of a sudden so strange and misplaced and unusual without any sort of precedent or instructional command. And I'd never thought about it like this before until I read this translation where, of course, he threw it. He's got a bowl and he's throwing blood on people. It is just absolutely disgusting.
Well, let's look at one thing that's not quite as bad. Verse 7 of 24, he took the book of the covenant. By the way, in the Hebrew, this is Sefer HaBrit, the scroll, the covenant scroll. And he read in the audience of the people, and they said, "All that Jehovah hath spoken, we will do and be obedient." We're going to do it and hear it. And I know Judaism makes a big deal about this, that the people said that they would do it before they even heard it, as a sign of sure obedience. But by the way, in Deuteronomy, I've taught before on 4 verbs that are repeated: listen, learn, guard, and do. And those are always in that order. So in Deuteronomy, when you have listen and do, it's always in that order. You listen, then you do. Exodus here in 24 gives itself away of something contradicting what we find in Deuteronomy. And I'm talking about, these are a lot of different examples in Deuteronomy. But here's the thing I wanted to bring up about the book of the covenant, Jono. That phrase, Sefer HaBrit, only occurs 4 times in all the Hebrew Bible. Once here in in Exodus chapter 24, verse 7, and all 3 other passages, 2 Kings 23, 2 and 21, and 2 Chronicles 34:30, all are used to describe the scroll, the authentic scroll that Moses wrote in that was discovered in the time of Josiah in the 18th year of his reign. Remember the story.
Yeah.
So here's my question. Kings and Chronicles gives 2 different stories. They contradict one another. One says in Kings, it says that he's a good boy, he's a righteous man, and they find the scroll, and then he does this purging of the land. So the revival follows the discovery of the scroll. Chronicles, the Judean court writer says, no, that's not what happened. He did a revival, and then there was a scroll that was found. Now, what scholars say is that they didn't find a scroll. They wrote a scroll to advance the revival and the law code that Josiah and his court wanted to put out, which explains why we have so many things about centralization of worship and that kind of thing.
Yep.
Here's what I think. I think it's a mix. I think there is really a scroll, the Moses scroll. The scroll that Moses actually wrote was in the temple. I think they found that. I think it was very much like what we have here. And I think that also there was a collection of sacred laws that Josiah, I think they were combined at this point. And what I think we see here in this covenant code is an attempt to sell this as the covenant code that was discovered in Josiah's time. except that we have evidence from Jeremiah that that covenant that was discovered, that scroll that was discovered, had nothing to do with sacrifices, anything to do with blood. None of that was there. And it got Jeremiah, almost got him killed because he stood up in the temple and said, God never said that, right? So,
he protested against it, yeah. So I have, just while we're on that, I have a slightly different take, and I could probably be persuaded either way. But I think they always had and were aware of the Moses scroll. I think that, and that's the reason why it pops up here and there. Like we have sound bites here and there, and it's borrowed, and especially in chapter 20 of Exodus. I think that which they say they found is the law code, chapter 22, chapter 12 to 26, and they say that it is the scroll of Moses because they want to pass it off as Mosaic and with ultimate authority. I don't know what. I guess my point is I'm not sure how much finding as there was fraud. Yeah, that's a possibility as well, I guess.
Yeah, but, I think it's a mix. Like I said, I think that there is something about, we have a lot of evidence that there was a discovery, but we also have some evidence that about that time other laws came in. One thing is for sure, and that is that throughout the biblical period, the people, and we can get this just from a casual reading from Joshua all the way through the biblical history, they certainly did not know, or at least they weren't following any legal code. Right. And so, but the way I present it in the Moses scroll is that the scroll that was discovered was very likely the Moses scroll that was void of all these additional elements, and then it would be mixed with, as you put it, this document that was
revised Josiah version.
Yeah, the revised Josiah version. But either way, there's something I think that the most pivotal period in biblical history, it to me feels like, and the Bible writers even tell us this, is during the time of Josiah. I think they even hint that there was never even a Passover until this time. They certainly say that no one kept it. So that's anyway, these are very interesting ideas, I'd say.
Absolutely. Chapter 24, verse 11, Ross, just wanted to throw this into the mix. They beheld God, 70 elders rock on up. Well, no, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 elders all go up. They're not allowed to go as close as Moses. God raises his hand and says, that's enough for you guys. But they beheld God, and they ate and drank before him with the sapphire and all of these ones. That's interesting because we're told that you saw no form, but you heard a voice. There's
Deuteronomy certainly says that, doesn't he?
Yeah. So again, I think these are the offcuts, and they've made a story out of it. One last thing that I just want to highlight, of course, is another connection with the Moses scroll, and that's 40 days and 40 nights. So, Ross, twice in Genesis chapter 7, we have 40 days and 40 nights. Twice in Exodus, we have it there. 5 times in Deuteronomy. And of those 5 times in Deuteronomy, twice it is derived from the Moses scroll. The Moses scroll mentions 40 days and 40 nights twice. But whilst it is within the Sinai narrative, neither of those 2 times comport to what we see here. What do we see here?
You talking about in Exodus?
In Exodus chapter 24, verse 18, Moses went inside the cloud and ascended the mountain. And by the way, I used to live on a mountain. I used to live over a kilometer above sea level. And every now and then a cloud would come and sit on that mountain. And it was so thick that whenever I entered it on, driving home to my place, I remember a couple of times I drove past my house because I just couldn't find it. It was that thick.
Wow.
Yeah, incredible. Anyway, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights, and what many people believe is that it's during this 40-day, 40-night period that he received all of these additional commands. Is that right?
Yeah, probably right about that, yeah.
And then, again, like you said, GB 2 and GB 10 and 11 our references in the Moses scroll to the 40 days and 40 nights.
49. Quite right.
Hey, this really is a packed. Do we have anything else? I think I'm out. I think I'm out. We're done. Do we then just tell everybody to get ready for next week is Terumah?
Terumah.
Yep. Exodus 25 through 27:19. That's going to be another good one too.
I tell you what. All right, we will be back this time next week. Ezra, wake up and take us out from this Torah portion.
That wraps up our deep dive into Mishpatim. From ancient legal codes to covenant ethics, this portion reminds us that justice isn't just about laws. It's about how we treat one another. If you enjoyed the discussion, don't forget to like, share, and spread the word. And of course, join us next time as we keep exploring the Torah, one portion at a time. See you then.